You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
So, if I begin with a prayer?
Yes, please.
So we invoke the Lord, the Creator of heaven and earth, to help us understand the beginning of life, the beginning of each one of us. And to this purpose, we invoke Mary, who was a faithful receiver of the word and lived it. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Amen. So, everybody, I'm here with Francis Etheredge. We've done several interviews together, and tonight we're going to do Conception, an Icon of the Beginning. How are you doing, Francis?
Right. Well, I've been rereading the book by way of preparation for this interview, and I somewhat was afraid of doing so because the book has traversed something like 20 years of writing and rewriting, and I was somewhat afraid of what I would find, in a sense, but actually I've enjoyed it. And although I haven't completely gone through cover to cover, nevertheless I've almost got there. And I began to think, well, in terms of this interview, what about taking the title itself, Conception, an Icon of the Beginning? And one of the starting points then is the very language of the title. Conception, in its etymology, means a beginning. So right away, there's a connection between the beginning, as it were, of everything, from the mystery of creation itself, and the beginning of each one of us. And also the term icon. Mary Ann Erlachius, who wrote the general foreword, explored this term, and one of the striking points she makes is that icon is equivalent to the written word, to the point where writers wouldn't speak, or painters wouldn't speak of painting an icon so much as writing it, that it was understood to be a non-verbal equivalent of the sacred page. And to some extent, that leads into, well, why choose this expression, conception, an icon of the beginning, when we're not dealing with a painted image? But nevertheless, on considering the beginning of each one of us, we are looking at a non-verbal event, as it were. And in this sense, the event is God bringing to exist a person who did not exist. And so there is a radical newness about each one of us. And that radical newness is not just an echo, as it were, of the beginning of creation. It is, in its own way, a reenactment of that beginning, because the beginning of each one of us is radically new, is from the Creator's own act. And in that sense, we're not just echoing or, in some sense, imitating the beginning of the universe, but there is this sense of it being as radically original, that each one of us comes from an act of God, as radically original as did the whole of creation. Now, clearly there are also differences, insofar as ordinarily the Lord takes up the work of our parents in the very bringing together in the spousal communion, the bringing together of the male and female contribution. And so there is a sense in which there are prior elements, as it were, which have their own significance, because we then, even in our individuality, are conceived in relationship. You know, that we don't emerge out of nothing. And in that sense, we do imitate or mirror the fact that because God, we believe, is the Blessed Trinity, that the very act of creation itself was an act which brought everything to exist, creation as a whole and each one of us in particular, in the context of the relationship between the unoriginate Father, the Son ever generated from the Father, and the Spirit who proceeds from both Father and Son. So we are in the midst of their love of each other. And so we are, even from the very beginning, conceived in relationship. So there is a very real sense when God created, when he looked, as John Paul II says in his letter to the family, when God looked at the divine we, he created us in such a way as to show forth that even as we come from our parents, we are conceived in relationship. Now that, first of all, is, as we ordinarily and humanly understand it, from our parents, in the context of our parents' relationship. But at the same time, we are also conceived in a relationship to God himself, as God is the one who acts, not just to bring us out of nothing, but to bring that fruitfulness from our parents. So we are very concretely created and conceived in relationship, both from the very beginning, bearing in mind the mystery of God as three persons in one God, but also concretely, subsequently, in each one of us being conceived in the relationship, as it were, of our parents. So there are different ways that there is this interrelationship between the very beginning and each one of us. And so this book explores the different ways that we can go back to this starting point and go forward from it. Well, if we begin by going back and look at the way that we can envisage, because we're dealing in some ways with the work of the imagination, because just as we're not actual witnesses to the beginning of each one of us, although remarkably Psalm 190, Psalm 139 speaks of almost a witness inspired of God bringing to exist the embryo, the unfinished vessel, as it's translated from the Hebrew golmi. And not just is it unfinished vessel, it's also, golmi means my unfinished vessel. So there is an occasionally inspired sense that a scriptural writer will give us of almost witnessing something which is unwitnessable. You know, it is in God who gives us the insight, because it is God, after all, who is present to what he does, in a way where we are always after the fact. We are always searching to understand what God has done in a prior way. And also we have that marvelous expression of Eve's, I have gotten a man with the help of God. Again, it's in the context of Adam knowing Eve, his wife. But when she speaks, or what she says is written, it's that perception that God has acted. I have gotten a man with the help of God. So there is this marvelous sense that right from the earliest testimony, God is recognized as present in a unique way in bringing each one of us to exist. But there is also this sense in which this is an imaginative work. And so even in the scriptures themselves, Job will talk about being curdled like cheese. This sense in which the scriptural writers struggled to find analogies that took something that was more everyday to help us understand the mystery of this beginning of each one of us. And going back to that Hebrew expression, golmi, meaning unfinished vessel, there is something remarkably apt about the fact that on the one hand we are a vessel, in that sense that we contain something, as St. Paul would say, of infinite value, certainly as we come into the Christian vocation. But at the same time, we are also, if you like, pregnant with value because God has acted at the beginning of us. And there's also the sense of, with the word unfinished, that what is begun with a view to its development. So going back to the beginning of the book, there is a long introduction in a way of using different images to help us embrace the unusualness or the difficulty of imagining what is going on. So, for example, there is the use of a candle. And it's a common event. You would see many candles in a liturgy, would you not?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a common event to see a candle lit. So on the one hand, we have a match or a lighter or another candle. And then we see what, first of all, is dead, is not in any way showing the signs of burning. And then it's lit. So there is this amazing sense that everyday imagery can help us see that there can be a real event of a beginning, but that real event always takes from something else. So, in the case of lighting a candle, we have the match, something which is prior and already burning. In the case of pen and paper, we have the very existence of the paper and the pen. But as soon as the mark is made, there's something irreversible. Just as with the lighting of the candle, there is something irreversible. And so it is with the imagining the beginning of each one of us. What takes place has an irreversibility about it. In the very intimate details of what we now understand to be the contact between the sperm and the ovum, the sperm being a thread-like moving germ cell, and the ovum being much larger, much more like an open-weaved ball of wool, something really quite massive in comparison to the sperm, but comparatively inert. It reaches a stage of development after being released from the ovary where it becomes inert. And there's something remarkable, because when the sperm then makes contact by entering one of the pores on the outside of the ovum, the egg, it then closes. And this is the first instant, one could say, of the new entity, because now we're no longer dealing with a sperm and an egg. Now we're dealing with a new entity that suddenly has moved when before it was inert. And I would almost call it a natural sacrament, because there's an outward sign of the possibility of an inward act of God, that it is at that moment when the ovum ceases to be inert, when the sperm ceases to be an independent entity, when they combine in this remarkable way and result in this formation of the embryonic wall, that we have an outward sign. Now, who would have imagined that actually this would become visible to us? But in one sense, it seems coherent that God, who always makes visible what he does, I mean, the very act of creation is making visible his presence, his activity, by bringing about the existence of the universe. So it seems very credible that the very beginning of the human being, of each one of us, even if we would ordinarily never witness it, nevertheless has an outwardness about it, a natural sacramental sign of the action of God within. So in this early part of the book, then, there is this long introduction of considering different kinds of analogies to help us understand that a beginning is also an irreversible beginning, and something which required the agent, just as lighting a candle, just as the writer who puts pen to paper. There needs to be an agent who brings about this irreversible change. And in this case, that agent is God himself. And this is what makes it such an extraordinary event, the conception of each one of us. But then also, in the course of the book, the scriptural accounts, as I've already indicated, are taken up. And even if we look at the detail of the way creation is described in the first account of Genesis, there is remarkable language which, even if we take it as a liturgical account of a mysterious event, of God bringing to exist what did not exist, nevertheless, what is first described as existing is something that is dark, is something that is without form, is something really a radical beginning over which the Spirit of God moves. And so there is, even within the imagination of the biblical author, the possibility of conceiving of a beginning that then unfolds. And so when we go back to this Psalm 139, where David considers the mystery of his own coming to exist, we have expressions like, all my days were written before any one of them was lived, as it were. A sense of a real beginning that is witnessed by God himself, but because it exists and because God witnesses it, it's then possible for us to dialogue with God, to dialogue with the evidence that we encounter, whether scientifically or through the scriptures or in our imagination, to dialogue about, well, what is the nature of this beginning? Because we do live in a time when so much of it is surrounded by uncertainty. Now, even if we take that uncertainty as legitimate, because there have been philosophical difficulties right from the beginning as to how to understand the human person. And so we have the language of form and matter, soul and body, and almost a kind of dualism in the history of philosophical thought. Whereas scripturally, we have much more of a sense of a whole being, a living being, nephesh, being something which came to exist. But philosophically, we also have an inheritance of the difficulties of how people understood through the use of their reason and in terms of primitive biology what was going on in conception. So these factors play into the present situation in such a way as to cloud the clarity that really is necessary so that we can establish, well, if we are human beings from conception, then ethically we are in a relationship to each other which requires and demands that we respect each other's life and nurture it. So, for example, when there are the fertilization of human eggs outside of the body, there is a radical sense of the injustice to this being, because the nature of nurturing requires implantation, requires that the child being conceived unfold in the way that the inner determinants of its development dictate. And that involves implantation and the whole unfolding of the embryonic life that is present. And what's so extraordinary is that there is no particular event from the beginning onwards whereby we can say anything occurs but that unfolding. So when we look at the baby born, when we look at the person growing up, actually what we have is simply continuity from that very first instant of fertilization. And therefore, what does that tell us? It tells us that there is an inwardness to the very beginning of human conception, which is making itself manifest. So the whole program of embryonic development of within the womb, in early infancy, is to manifest the person that is present. And that is such an extraordinary process. You know, how people can imagine that there isn't anything but the beginning of a person almost is more difficult than imagining what actually occurs. Because when you have as in the book, the scientific evidence compiled by Professor Justo Aznar and his colleague Tudela as well, they put together the intricate evidence that is being assembled. So, for example, it is perfectly relevant where the sperm penetrates the ovum, because this sets up an axis that then determines future developments as the embryo develops. You know, subtle things that you wouldn't have thought would make any difference. You have the ovum is almost a porous entity, as I've said, but as soon as the sperm strikes it, it's enclosed. Now, any one of those porous entries then, the sperm could have entered, but in doing so, it sets up a system of development which is radically significant in terms of how it then unfolds. So the detail that is now possible through various kinds of investigations on mouse embryos or other kinds of creatures, quite apart from what comes incidentally from these other extramarital experiments, you could say, is already pointing towards a highly organized moment which then unfolds. And it's this detail that goes beyond even just understanding that the embryo develops, because it then starts to show us that there's what's called the epigenetic relationship. So there is a kind of feedback from the mother who carries the child that impacts the genetic development of the child, so that the unfolding is not without contact, not without a kind of process of communication with the mother. So the possibility of the mother knowing the presence of the child is also there in this implicit way that there are changes that she is undergoing that are also impacting on the development of the embryonic child. So there is this interactive element which really gives credence to the recognition of the woman's perception that she knows she's pregnant before even perhaps the possibility of a pregnancy test. Because it's not just that she is, if you like, a passive vehicle of what has come to be present, but there is this intricate interaction between herself and the implantation of the child. So there are all kinds of remarkable insights which confirm what Eve said right at the beginning of the scriptures in such a simple way: I have gotten a child with the help of God. I mean, it is such a marvelously simple expression which encompasses so much. So in one sense, this dialogue between the event now as we understand conception and what's possible in terms of scrutinizing the scriptures, it's not that we're looking for the scriptures to be an embryological account, but rather we're looking for that sense of the development of understanding, the witness of an event by human beings of what's going on within them, which of course is characteristic of us as human beings. You know, whether it's the man or Job thinking about how he comes to exist as a curdled cheese, or Eve in this way, or even the mother of the martyrs in the second book of Maccabees, where she talks almost scientifically, you know, about the coming together of the elements which God has brought about. And she herself makes this connection with just as God brought everything to exist from the beginning, from nothing. So she says, God has done this with you, my sons, as she's encouraging them in the front of their martyrdom. And so, you know, in different ways, different authors address this natural question, which is really right at the root of our existence. How do we come to be? In what way can we express it convincingly? What imagery or what perception of the reality do we actually possess? And so the book then moves on to the different declarations, also of the fathers, because one of the characteristics of the development of doctrine is its relation to the fathers of the church. And one of the striking origins to their thought was really two strands. One was to regard the conception of Christ as entailing everything that was characteristic of human development, except, of course, the fact that Christ didn't have a natural father, although he had a natural mother in Mary, the mother of the Lord. So on the one hand, they grasped that whatever was characteristically part of our nature, he redeemed through taking it on, except this presence of the Father's contribution to conception. But then, on the other hand, there was a distancing of others I think through the philosophical tradition. So, for example, St. Thomas would regard, on the one hand, Christ as being conceived from the very first instant. Otherwise, the divine nature would have been united to something less than human, if that were the case. And so he distinguished the conception of Christ from our conception, which he saw in terms of three stages: plant, animal, and then human or rational. Even if he said the project from conception was always with a view to the ensoulment of a human being. So he didn't understand it literally, if you like, as plant, animal, and human, so much as they were three stages, but at the same time they were encompassed. And Thomas is marvellous in his insights, even when he's wrong, that the whole process was encompassed by this project, as it were, of becoming human. And when you think that in terms of our modern understanding of the structure of the sperm and the structure of the ovum and the inheritable characteristics and the genetic code on the chromosomes, there is this whole structuring of our humanity. It's not arbitrary at all. It's present in a whole number of ways. But at the same time, there was this conflict in the tradition. But the fathers seem to be much more unified in the sense of there being a whole being present from conception. And one father particularly saw in the conception of Christ the way to understand ordinary human conception. That if Christ comes to renew our humanity, so he also takes it on from, just as he took it on from the first instant, so do we. So that there is no prior process whereby we're kind of a plant-like creature and then an animal-like creature, but rather we are human from the first instant. So there emerges a more consistent understanding, even from the fathers of the church. And then, of course, we have the whole progress of the magisterial teaching as it articulates increasingly our modern, taking account of our modern understanding of what is happening at conception. And one of the major moments, I think, although it's still somewhat undeveloped, is the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, that Mary is conceived without sin, but she is conceived in a wholly human way, unlike in that respect Christ himself, who is conceived through the Holy Spirit, not through the contribution of the human Father. Whereas Mary, in being conceived without sin, is also conceived in a wholly human way. And through pondering different writers, and especially a book by Father John Soward, where he refers to different contributions of the fathers, one begins to understand that actually the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of Mary has within it the possibility of a new beginning in our understanding of human conception. Because, as I say, she was wholly conceived in humanity, as we are, through the coming together of her parents. And in that sense, she is, if you like, the model of our humanity. And in this preeminent sense of being without sin, then, as St. Thomas says, there can't be the presence of grace unless there is the presence of the subject, the person who is capable of being graced. And so there is an intrinsic argument, one could say, within the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, that she had to be wholly conceived from the beginning, from the first instant, if she was going to be completely graced and freed from any possibility of original sin. Because if she wasn't present whole and entire, one in body and soul, as Gaudium et Spes would say, then how could grace be present? So in other words, the very logic of the Immaculate Conception implies a union from the first instant if the presence of the soul was to be there as what makes possible the presence of grace, because this is the wholeness which constitutes the human person and therefore makes her capable of being graced. So there is, in the language of the Immaculate Conception, again, the possibility of a renewal of our understanding of the conception of each one of us. But I don't think this has been drawn upon to the extent that it needs to be, because in the magisterial documents, there isn't really a reference either to the Incarnation or to the Immaculate Conception, that rather there is this struggle to identify conception as a beginning, but without recourse to these two great Christian mysteries, which I think have so much potential for helping us to understand the beginning of each one of us. Nevertheless, what we have in the magisterial documents is a growing appreciation of conception as being a moment, as it were, even if somewhat undefined, that constitutes a first beginning. And as St. John Paul II said in the Gospel of Life, even if there were uncertainty about whether a person comes to exist from the first moment or not, still we would be morally obliged, because of that uncertainty, to desist from anything that could possibly harm that new entity coming to exist. Because after all, we can't be certain that, in fact, the person isn't present from the very first instant. So, in the language of the Gospel of Life, there is a very clear recognition that even where uncertainty exists because of philosophical reasons or uncertain biology or for whatever reason, nevertheless, there is a moral requirement that we desist from anything that would possibly harm the coming to exist at that moment, because either it is already present, the person in their entirety, as it were, in a nascent state, or it will be very shortly the coming to exist of a person. Either way, we are morally required to desist from anything but being helpful. And so this perception is becoming clearer and clearer, as I say, in the documents of the Church. And even in those works which are not expressly about the beginning of life, you've got remarkable statements, really. I mean, in, for example, Familiaris Consortio, where he speaks of the soul being, as it were, incarnate in the body. Now, even if he's not explicitly talking about the moment of conception, nevertheless, this language of the soul being incarnate in the body echoes that tradition, as I referred to earlier, of Christ being conceived from the first instant. But not just being conceived, but the whole mentality of incarnation. That there is something which comes to exist almost from all eternity. And then what we end up contemplating is the fact that God envisages each one of us from all eternity. Now, we're not like the eternal Son that we've pre-existed, but nevertheless, he has a vision of each one of us. And that is a vision of a person. That is a vision of a whole being, not parts, as it were, not first a plant and then an animal and then a human creature. It's a vision of a person. And that then is what is the object of conception. That there comes to exist a whole person, and a person, if you like, redolent with relationships. So on the one hand, as we said, or I said right at the beginning, we're not only coming to exist as a son or daughter, but also we come into existence in relation to the whole Blessed Trinity, to the whole family of man that exists throughout time. And so there is this immense sense of our individuality isn't without reference to the community of human beings. And that expresses again this mystery of the Blessed Trinity. Both one God, but three persons in one God. So we are no sooner existing as an individual person than we are immersed in just the immeasurable relationships that stem from that very fact, both in relation to God, in relation to our own family, and in relation to the whole human race. So there is this kind of immeasurable sense of one mystery echoing another. But then there's also this whole difficult terminology of form and matter, soul and body, and all the problems it presents. So then the book goes on to discuss how it is that we can make sense of this language. One of the problems that arose, you could say, is because Aristotle had the understanding that matter always existed, his sense of form then determining what any particular type of matter was, whether it was going to be a rock, or whether it was going to be a plant, or whether it was going to be an animal or a human being. He had this conception of an eternally existing matter that was then determined to be what it was by the introduction of a form. Now, in one sense, it makes, that if you don't know whether creation always existed, that you take the theme, as it were, of matter always existing, and then you see how it's altered, just as you have wood, and it can be turned into a chair, or it can be turned into a staff, or it can be turned into timbers for a house. But you have a basic material that is then modified in different ways. Now, one of the differences then between this more philosophical origin to the terms form and matter that are part of the background to soul and body is the fact that the scriptural approach, I think, and like the fathers as well, is more holistic, that we understand a whole entity to come to exist, a whole person comes to exist, a man comes to exist, a woman comes to exist, a child comes to exist. I think there is within the scripture a different perception of the wholeness of each entity that God brought to exist. And so the two streams of thought, as it were, the scriptural and the philosophical, have to come into dialogue, have to be resolved. But I think that is by far and away the more difficult part of the book, discussing the different ways that we can understand form and matter, body and soul, especially because it gives rise to this possibility of dualism, that we have on the one hand soul and we have on the other hand body. But actually, the relationship of form to matter is far more intimate than a dualism would give rise to. That even if we overlook for the moment the sense of an eternal matter, still the understanding of form was as an inner determinant of the new being that came to exist. And so it's really an intimate relationship, form and matter. But then when you take away the fact that the matter is not pure potentiality, as Aristotle defined it, so it was nothing, and that form made it what it was. And you think, well, in terms of the actual origin that we now know of sperm and egg, we actually have, if you like, real determinants that emerge from the biological entities themselves. And so we then have to engage with the fact that we're not dealing with something that is without its own determinants. And this is what's so crucial when it comes to hybrid experiments, that there is a dreadful possibility of people in a laboratory bringing to exist a creature that is human but is disguised in its humanity because its basic ingredients have been mixed up between creatures. And so there are dreadful possibilities, really. But in a positive sense, what we understand from the emerging understanding of embryology is that there are real determinants that emerge out of our humanity, so that ensoulment isn't something which simply magically transforms everything as if it had no identity whatsoever in the beginning, because we understand so much more about genetic inheritance, about the structural properties of the ovum, about the dynamic intervention of the sperm, and all these consequences. So really, in grappling with this interaction between the different sources, scriptural, philosophical, embryological, we have to come to a new understanding as best we can of the fact that God has given real determinants that the parents contribute to their child, to the new human being. But at the same time, he makes possible a substantial change, a change within these determinants, so that it is not just a creature which is transmitted. It is a human being that comes to exist through the moment of the first instant of fertilization. And so the book, as best it can, works through these different arguments and nuances, attempting to show what's possible in terms of a reconciliation of them. And one of the expressions that runs throughout the book is the following: where the body lives, there the soul is, and where both are is the human person. It's not as if it's one or the other. It's not as if it's soul or body. It's rather the whole, and the whole in such a way as inseparable. And even if death presents us with a problem, we know from Scripture death is an unintended consequence as regards the Creator's plan for human being. But at the same time, it presents a problem. So how do we understand death in the light of the insoluble interpenetration of soul and body? And therefore, death has to be understood as a rupture of an ontological unity that is so profound that it almost calls for the resurrection, as St. Thomas says at one point. That even if we didn't know of the doctrine of the resurrection, almost the unity is so profound that it would call for its restoration, because the original plan of God was this integrity, to be irrevocably united, one in soul and body. And so, even with all the difficulties that there are, especially considering twins and conjoined twins, you know, this principle of where the body lives, there the soul is. In other words, if there is evidence of another human body, as with twinning, there is evidence then of another human being. So where there's any sort of confusion or uncertainty in terms of embryological development, I think it's a very useful principle to say, did an independent body come to exist, or if not exist, completely, even incompletely, as with conjoined twins? You have something capable of being a human person because it is sufficiently different to the other twin. And so this is a reality. But even where two people are joined either by limb or in whatever way, you nevertheless have two people. And this is essential for understanding what is actually happening. So that where possible, and I understand recently there was the separation of two conjoined twins, we are dealing with two people, not just one and a problem of another, but rather two people. And so this approach is essential, really, for clarifying this whole area, that we need simple principles. And so one of them is, where there is a body that is discernibly independent, even if not completely so, there the soul is present, and there together is the whole human person. And so it takes it right through to understanding how we can call back from this morass of experimentation and unregulated practices to finding a common identity to our human nature at its very origin, that it may be useful not just in terms of clarifying some kind of abstract question, but also addressing in a very practical way the fact that people are making decisions day in, day out, increasingly, about the moment of origin and what happens to the person that's created when they're not properly understood to be a person, and actually they are. So any clarity that is possible, hopefully, will be a clarity that increases in the political and legal field, so that there is a better understanding of how to protect human life from the very beginning.
That's impressive. That's an impressive train of thought that you've written down here. It's a lot of things I'd never really considered.
Oh, thank you. I've gone on, rather.
Oh, that was all interesting. You can go on all you want. It's always interesting. So it is, really. You have a very fruitful mind. Very fruitful. And, all these interviews, there's never been a time when, and you present things in a way also that are understandable. So I've always been able to follow everything you've been saying, and it's always been very interesting. You really have a fruitful mind.
Thank you.
This really, yes, you're welcome. But this was really exceptional. Because we know body-soul unity, but I don't think most of us ever sit down and really try to puzzle out what that really means. So very, very good.
It is such an intricate path, and in one way, one criticism of the book was it was too long and involved. But on the other hand, having started this investigation some 20 years ago, I couldn't relinquish the fact that it sometimes takes us a long, circuitous route to get to where we want to go. And so the earlier part of the book, where I look at possible analogies, like the designer who embodies the design in a machine, even a washing machine. It's design is no longer separate. Although it can stay on the page, as it were, of the engineer, it's now in a machine. It's embodied in the machine. All the parts of that machine wouldn't be what they are if it wasn't for that design, which originates the whole and all its intricate parts. And in the same way, then, it's this sense of coming to simpler expressions, perhaps, but only after this intricate path of following the different witnesses of Scripture, following the different accounts of the fathers and the magisterial documents. And, the fact that the Magisterium at one point says that there is no philosophical clarity about the moment that the human person comes to exist. I mean, it really is a fantastically challenging statement. But why isn't there any philosophical clarity? And as one sort of looks into the terminology, so one sees all the difficulties of trying to reconcile form and matter in its different and original senses with what we know now to exist embryologically. And so drawing on the Christian mysteries is also a great help. The nature of a sacrament, an outward sign of an inward work of God, the mystery of Christ's incarnation, the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Faith and reason absolutely not only but fructify, really assist one another. And so going back to St. Thomas, who said, well, there was eternally existent and that there was no origin to the universe as we know it. But, he says, because we know that there is a beginning. And I think in that sense, it also applies to the problem of understanding the beginning of each one of us. That with all the difficulties that we have, we can imagine all kinds of possibilities, and the problem of resolving them is immense. But there is actually also dogmas, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. There is also the witness of Scripture, real human beings pondering what it was that happened when they came to exist. And so I think it has to be that the future of the Church's reflection has to draw on her whole, if you like, inheritance. Not only what's known embryologically, but also the whole inheritance of the Testament of the Fathers, of the scriptural witness, of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. I think there is such a fruitful, dawning awaiting that, and it's absolutely necessary in the times in which we live and the confusion that exists about the human person's beginning.
Yeah. Well, this is well thought out, and you're raising good questions and good points. So I think this is something that, this is a book that when people read it, they'll, it will probably change their perception on much of this. We just don't think deeply enough when we think about what it is to be a person, and to be, to be body and soul. We just kind of take it for granted, and go about our daily life.
Yeah.
So it's good that you're raising these issues.
Also, one of the comments that Father John Saywood made when he endorsed the book was it is unusually a combination of different ways of communicating. So there are poems in the book, not only by me, but by others. There are, as I've described, different kinds of imagery, different kinds of sources to the book itself. But then there are also different forwards from different people. And then right at the end, Elizabeth Rex wrote a chronological account of, the beginnings of the imaginative understanding of what's possible with creating a new person. And she took as her starting point Frankenstein. And it really was prescient in a sense, that people were thinking even at the time of Mary Shelley's book of what it would be to create a being and how alienated that being was from the person who created it. And, that seems to me a profound possibility that were any of these experiments on human embryos to ever mature, what an alienation is possibly being brought to exist between the person whose being has been so altered and those that have done it. I mean, it's really
terrifying,
a dreadfully serious scenario that's in front of us. So, God willing, any clarity that the Church can bring to bear on this whole question has hopefully got to be a help. And especially in terms of declarations of human rights. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that now what can go on in laboratories was objected to at the Second World War in the Nuremberg trials. How is it possible that people can now do in laboratories what was forbidden once it was discovered in the Nuremberg trials? There are so many discrepancies that there is such a need for clarity about the existence of the human person that can then be translated into very simple legislation that's universal and defends the whole human patrimony of being a human being.
To me, it's all very terrifying, actually, because the problem is that if people can do something, they will. If the possibility exists, they usually will try it. And, I cannot imagine how really horrible some of these scenarios could be.
Yeah. So I think part of what we must also remember is it's not just the gospel of life, it's also a gospel of hope and a gospel of love. That, as it says in one of the other documents of the Second Vatican Council, truth has a gentle persuasiveness. And so if at the very least we've managed to tread a path that teaches us what the truth is, that possibility of others being taught is there, because there is a persuasiveness, because God is at work, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, wherever truth is present, it is a work of the Holy Spirit. And so, God willing, we also live in this expectation of hope and the help of God, because the confusion and the possibilities of it all going awry are too evident. We need the help of God.
Yes, I agree. Well, I thank you once again for a very interesting interview and for the opportunity to interview you. And I know we have some other books to cover coming up, so I look forward to doing those with you also.
Well, you're very encouraging, thank you. Would you like to end us with a prayer then?
Certainly. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee.
The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now, at the hour of our death.
And at the hour of death. Amen. Well, I look forward to interviewing you again soon. And thank you again. Take care.
Well, thank you too. All right.
Yep.
God bless. Bye.
Yep.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.